Thank you very much. So first of all, I wanted to start with some great news because having done quite a few of these conferences before, I've always felt I needed to talk to the issue of ROI, or results, or outcomes, data, all those things, because obviously you can't really operate in enterprise if you don't have that. But the story was not always necessarily easy to tell, I have to be honest. But the great news is, standing here today, is that we've really seen some change here. And these are some stats from the work that we've done ourselves, but these are happening all across the industry as well. Companies generating these kinds of fantastic outcomes, as you can see here. So without wanting to be complacent, because we still need to talk about ROI, we've moved on, and we can now begin to talk about other things that would be related to releasing and realizing the potential for this kind of ROI from this fantastic technology. And when we're talking about that, an interesting way to frame it is in what we call the journey to organizational maturity. It's up here, it's a little bit small text, but this is a sequence of steps, or we can say pain points, that each organization has to go on their journey towards becoming mature with this technology. It doesn't always go in this order, but very often pretty much this sequence. And it ranges from, as anybody that works in the space knows, education. As much as there's been lots of development here and it's a much better understood technology, there is still a need to educate certain customers, certain parts of the market. And then there's use cases. Where should we begin? What are the right applications of this technology? And then content, how long is it going to take me to build it? How much is it going to cost? Who should I get to build it? All these kind of questions that need to be answered. And then hardware. There are so many options out there. Which ones should I use? How should I deploy my content to that hardware? What MDM solution should I use? And we've had some people here presenting on that topic. It's a tricky one. And then distribution as well. So how do I get this into the hands of my learners, my end users, efficiently? And you get some big variations there, just things as simple as permanent employees versus contractors, for instance. And so if I've done that and they're all generating data, that needs to be consistent. It needs to all be in one place. And I need to be able to analyze that to ensure that I understand the benefits of this technology, the ROI. And that needs to be done securely. It needs to be GDPR compliant. It needs to follow company security protocols and so on. And then I need some subset of that which will go into my existing systems, my learning management systems, whatever it might be. And that needs to sit alongside the other data that I'm generating from my other technologies. And then if this is taking off across my organization, and I've got business units and teams using this tech and creating applications, then I need to get my arms around that, and I need to ensure that that is operationalized in a sort of centralized and consolidated fashion. And I need to ideally ensure that I'm driving standardization across those things as well, because you don't want the learner to have to learn how to use the app every single time. So standardized UX, standardized methods for authenticating users in, and standardized data. But if we look at all of these problems which companies have to face, and there's lots of people tackling them, we as a company do, there's a really big one that sits underneath it and is really foundational, and that is related to content. So content pops up all across this sequence. And really, it's certainly in the training space, there isn't a proposition here without content. It sort of doesn't matter what hardware you're using or the problems that you might have around deployment. If you don't have content, there is no value. And if we look at the characteristics that we see of content and the problems associated with that, they tend to break down into three things, which would be cost, choice, and consolidation. And that's what I'm going to dig into today. So if we start with cost, sorry, the slides are not rendering particularly well here, apologies, I don't know why that is. Then this is a fairly well-established model where you need a critical mass of content to drive a critical mass of engagement from users or from customers, or in this instance, from businesses. The more content, the more users, the more content. And you get this kind of virtuous circle, flywheel, that ultimately drives scale, efficiency, and reduces cost. You see this in lots of other parallel industries. It can be quite a tricky problem to solve because it can be chicken and egg, because you can't drive the creation of the content unless you've got an audience. And the audience won't come unless you've got the content. So you need to break this stalemate. And there are ways to do it. And I'm going to talk about two in particular today. The first one being what you might call a one-to-many model of authoring tools. And there's lots of companies presenting authoring tools here. There's lots of them out in the expo as well. It's a fantastic way for one person, without necessarily having lots of technical skills, to be able to generate significant volumes of content using low-code and no-code content authoring tools. But there's a reason that sophisticated game engines like Unity and Unreal exist, and that's because to create the breadth of experience that we see in games and in training, you need sophisticated tools. And there are some types of training experience that just can't be created without those things. So as much as these tools are great, they tend to be relatively narrow in focus. So we see a lot of, for instance, soft skills and people skills kind of applications where it's a relatively predictable interaction with an avatar. It's a conversation, and that will be driven by a decision tree. And you can create some really compelling and fantastic experiences there, but because it's a relatively well-defined flow. But we, as a company over the years, have built some really complicated things that just don't fit into those kind of relatively simple flows. So as much as these are very powerful tools, they can't solve every problem. Now, the flip side of this is that you see, obviously, tremendous amounts of custom content being built. That's where the industry is at in many places. And we actually are looking at this all the time as a company. And through our research and through all the conversations that we're having all the time with partners and with these companies, we've actually found there are over 300 of these content creation companies that vary from employees of hundreds or thousands in some instances, right down to employees of one or two. So huge variation in size. And also in terms of distribution, they're everywhere. They're all over the world, which wouldn't be a surprise. But that variation in size and in geography is also accompanied by a variation in subject matter focus as well. So here, if we break these things down a bit, some of these aren't a surprise if you're aware of the space, but we see a heavy indexing of certain things. Health and safety, obviously. There's 104 companies that are focused on building health and safety content, 45 on people skills, and 92 on technical, and so on. That's a lot of companies doing sort of quite similar things, and what you end up seeing there is quite a lot of repetition. So there's a lot of fire safety apps out there, and within health and safety, there's a lot of working at heights apps, and there's a lot of confined spaces apps. All really good content, but it's kind of the same with some minor variations. And what's really interesting is that enterprise customers are commissioning these companies to build this stuff, even though it sort of already exists, which doesn't seem entirely logical, really. And then on top of that, if we look at the average cost of developing these kinds of custom applications, it ranges somewhere between $45,000 to $250,000. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course. It can be a lot more expensive. But roughly speaking, it falls into this bracket when we're talking to our partners and when we think about our own content. So it's expensive. We can't get away from that fact. That is a lot of money to invest into a single application. You've got to have a pretty solid business case for that. And then it's also the fact that it's not just about cost. It's also about effort, because it takes a long time to specify what you want to build, to find the right company to deliver it, to contract them and procure them, and negotiate on price, and then for them to build it, and for you to test it, and for you to then pilot it, and so on and so on and so on. So it's expensive, but it's also very, very effortful as well. And the strange thing is, coming back to this point about repetition, they're very often building apps that already exist. And this is still happening all the time. The other thing is that content creators, of course, are largely working on time and materials models, which is, the margins are hard. It's a good hit of revenue because you tend to make big lump sums, but it's kind of a sugary hit. And it often means that these companies are putting their eggs in quite a small number of baskets. They're working with a small number of customers, and if something happens with that customer, they're very vulnerable. They're heavily invested. So it works from a revenue perspective, but it doesn't work overall, and in fact, it doesn't work for the industry as well, because it means you're having to spend lots and lots of money to sort of get into the game if you're not using the authoring tools. But the interesting thing is, when we're talking to these companies, is that very often they're already looking at creating licensable content, off-the-shelf content, or in their contracts with their customers, they've managed to retain the IP, which is really interesting, but they're not doing anything with it. It's kind of, we sort of joke about it being just in a drawer or in a cupboard. Really high quality content, gathering dust and not being monetized and exploited and not getting the audience that it actually deserves. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, it's just as basic a lot of the time as too busy, too many other priorities, too focused on core business. But also maybe not having the right route to market, not having a sales team that can go out and sell this thing. So, but if we could harness all of that content from those 300 companies and from the companies that already have off-the-shelf content but are also retaining the IP for their content, then we could actually move to what is the flip of the one-to-many and the many-to-one, where we take all this content that exists already from these 300 companies and you put it into one place. So you're bringing content from all vendors together in one place, which to me just has a sort of inevitable logic. But there are more things to consider, of course, because there needs to be a balance here between the business and the content. So from a business's perspective, they want that reduced cost, they want that greater choice and flexibility, and they want a lower entry point as well, where they don't have to make such a significant investment and it doesn't carry so much risk. From a content creator side, they want those improved margins, of course, and they want that recurring revenue stream because it makes it more predictable and forecastable. And they want to be able to spread the risk across a wider number of customers, so increasing the breadth of that customer base. If you can get that balance, if you can get that kind of mutually advantageous value exchange taking place, then that gets this virtuous circle or flywheel spinning, and that's what will drive choice and lower cost ultimately. So alongside that, because it's not just about access to a variety of content, it's also about not just technical, but the commercial flexibility and choice that goes alongside that. So if you've got all your content in one place, you need the right kind of license terms to reflect the variations in content, because highly specialized content for a particular piece of pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment, where you're really only targeting 10 users a year, and we have a customer that does that, it's very, very different to rolling out a DEI application to 5,000, 10,000 people. They're completely different, and you need commercial terms that reflect that. You need that flexibility. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And then that needs to flow through into distribution as well, because obviously size there, the volume of those users, and then all the other attributes as well, the other variations in your audience, mean that you need different methods of distribution to accompany those commercial models. And then alongside that, pricing, because not every app is going to be the same. There's huge variations in the kinds of applications that we see. It's highly specialized or it's very broad. Is it accredited? Is it regulated? Because that probably drives a higher value. How many people are you looking to target? What's the length of the training? All these things, these criteria that will essentially drive price. But it needs to be simple. It needs to be straightforward in order for companies to be able to access it. And then the other thing is, of course, that if you've got all this content coming from all these different vendors, you don't want to have to contract with all of them. So the ideal scenario, and we hear this from our customers all the time, is it's a one-stop shop, or we hear it referred to as a one-throat choke, which is not such a nice term, but that's kind of what people want. And often that will sit under a master services agreement, so there's really only one place that they go to, and they can get this content from absolutely everywhere. And we hear this all the time. And if we can make the technical and the commercial constraints lower, or go away even in some instances, that means more companies will be able to embrace this technology, and the market will widen in general. So it won't just be the big Fortune 1000 companies, or the big enterprise companies that we can start to build into that medium-sized company space. And so if we can do that, we can say that we've tackled, maybe not fully solved, but certainly tackled the issue of cost and choice. But what about consolidation? So we've got all our content in one place, but that doesn't include the custom content, because you don't want one place for all of your off-the-shelf licensable content and then another place for all of your custom content, because it just doesn't make any sense. You're going to be running two systems. So again, you need to think about how that is all brought into one place. And we have an example of a global mining company that we work with, who the task there was to bring 50 existing applications into a single system. And that was across seven different vendors that they had, all across the business, across multiple business units. And it's a reasonable task to get that all standardized and consolidated into a single place. So ideally, you would be thinking about this before the horse has bolted. It's great that you see this kind of success and this kind of adoption of the technology, but it needs to be done in a manageable and scalable manner. So we can't think of custom content as being completely different or separate somehow to off the shelf. What we really want to see is all the content coming in from those 300 companies alongside all of your custom applications too, all being consolidated again into a single place. So it's genuinely bringing all content into a single place. But that is consolidation in its most basic form. But if we think about what consolidation means more widely, or what a deeper level of consolidation looks like, we need to think about consistency and standardization. And the big items here are things like user experience. So you don't, as I said before, you don't want your users to have to learn how to use every single app. You just want them in there doing the training. So consistent user experience, interaction models, things like locomotion and teleportation need to be the same. Menu systems and UI, you want that to be as similar as possible and to be familiar to the user if you can, wherever possible. And the same would apply to distribution. You need that to be completely consistent, but it also has to be flexible. So it's a difficult balance to strike there because it's very different distributing content to office workers in a major city in comparison to delivering content to people that pump gas in gas stations across Argentina, which is a use case that we see. Completely different. They require a different approach and actually completely different distribution flows as well. But nevertheless, it still needs to be consistent. It needs to be able to be, from an operational perspective, run in an efficient manner. And then also, reporting data needs to be consistent as well. It doesn't matter if your reporting data is pass or fail, or a score system, or if you want to capture absolutely everything that the user is doing, or it's just a completion statement that you want to send back into your LMS to tick a box. That's totally fine as well. But you need to have both the flexibility and the consistency across all of those things, so you can compare like for like, and so that you have all those. You have a consistency across all of your content. So if we can drive that consistency, then we can say that we have tackled consolidation properly, not just in a basic fashion. And if we have all of those things together, then we can say that we have, in a summary statement, the cost-effective consolidation of choice, which is kind of an oxymoron, but sort of true. That's kind of what you want. You want choice, but it's got to be done in a way that you can really get your arms around. And so, obviously, I'm here today representing Immerse. I have not been too salesy with these slides. In fact, we have another presentation in 15 minutes from my colleague, John Fetchy, on the collaboration, training, and education stage, where we do talk a bit more about ourselves. But today I wanted to really focus on, I guess, what I would see as the conceptual framework for tackling some of these big problems around content. Because we see a sort of inevitable logic and trajectory towards this consolidation of choice. And we believe, obviously you would know, that this industry is going to be huge as well. But we have to work together to make it happen. And we have to stop thinking about creating our own walled gardens where you're either all in with us or you're not. And we need to find ways to be able to open our arms. And from our perspective, from the perspective of Immerse, that's what we're doing. We're opening our arms to anyone and everyone that wants to collaborate where it makes sense. Because the opportunity is so big and exists in so many different places that we don't need to feel that we have to own everything. We should be looking at the things that we're really good at and forging models that truly work for enterprise customers to ensure that we're delivering the value that we are best at. So just going to leave you with this quote. It's a well-known one, but we really believe in this. This is where we need to be heading as an industry. We need to have the thinking that a rising tide lifts all boats. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions for Joseph?
Hi there.
Justin, I apologize. We had a Joseph earlier. Do we have any questions for Justin? There we go.
Hey, Justin. I
Hello.
work at one of the many content companies that you were referring to.
Yeah.
We have our own learning platform with our own analytics, but we make our own content. We don't aggregate content as you do. What advice would you have for providers like us who maybe go a bit deeper with our analytics than you might when you're taking an aggregated approach, but
Yeah.
still looking for an avenue of wider distribution?
Yeah, I mean, so from our perspective, actually one of the things that we're really looking at the moment is data and providing that flexibility across levels, because, you know, companies like yourselves obviously are potentially providing incredibly rich data. And we're building a system at the moment that would drive that degree of flexibility across what we define as 4 levels, actually. So I would say that we should probably just have a conversation about what's coming and how we could support that. But in general, I would say it's to sort of talk about this IP point. I don't know how it works for you guys, but I think that's really key, is that in the negotiations with customers, trying to make sure that you retain the IP so that it is then something that you can further monetize, as opposed to, you know, something that just is then owned by the customer. Because then you've got lots of options, and whether that data always has to be as rich as it is for that one customer, as opposed to for absolutely everybody, maybe that's a conversation as well. Because if you're buying off-the-shelf content, you may not have the same level of expectations around data. But yeah, we should have a chat, because, you know, we're developing something that is much more sophisticated.
What else do we have? What other questions do we have for Justin? Okay.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.